Okay, I get it. We're trying to keep it short. So the first is the whole blood thing of the 19th century when capitalism was born. I get it.
And like the inevitable economic crisis.
Economic crisis, got it.
Economic crisis.
Yeah.
And basically, where the war is going for the very highly chance.
No mobility, got it.
Yeah, like social.
Yeah. Get it.
That's right.
Okay, I'll take those three. All right, so the challenges are: one, isn't capitalism full of bloodshed and injustice, taking people off their land and forcing them into factories? And then second is economic crises, and the third was social accountability. First I've heard of that. Mobility, social mobility, yes. Okay, let's start with bloodshed. Oh my God. I think it's one of the greatest tragedies, I think, of modern education is that you don't learn what happened in the 19th century. You learn what Marxists want to believe happened in the 19th century, but not what actually happened in the 19th century. You don't learn that, again, 90+% of humanity was dirt poor. They weren't forced off the farms. I'm not saying they weren't here and there some exceptions, but they weren't forced off the farms. What they did was left the farms for better opportunities in the city, just like is happening all over the world still. People are leaving the farms because the farms, anybody, what's life like on a farm? Wake up in the morning at sunrise, there's no electricity, you work all day, and you go to bed when the sun sets. And what do kids do in the farm? Everybody blames the 19th century as child labor. Oh my God, children worked. What did they do before the Industrial Revolution? They worked from sunrise to, well, actually, mostly they died. Because most kids didn't make it to 10. They died. So during the 19th century, they left this horrible lifestyle and they went to the cities and got grubby jobs, what we would consider today grubby jobs, just like Chinese today are leaving the farms and going to work for Foxconn, right? In what we consider in the West, grubby jobs. For them, it's a path to middle classhood, but for us, it's grubby jobs. Their life expectancy increases dramatically. Their kids are not dying. Wealth is being created, so now parents can afford to send their kids to school. Parents can also now afford cleanliness, which is part of why life expectancy increases, is we learn that, you know, where germs come from, and we have the wealth to be able to be clean. This is one of the 19th century, in context, is the most magnificent human century in history. It is a century where we go from poverty to wealth. It is a century in which we go from nobody gets an education, almost everybody gets an education. It's a century in which we go from living horrible, miserable, pathetic lives to the beginnings of the kind of lives we have today. And instead of studying that period and trying to understand exactly what happened and how it happened, we demonize it in the name of demonizing capitalism. But that is not the reality. The reality is not blood, certainly not anywhere close to the proportion of blood in socialism. Socialism is rivers of blood. Not to say everything that happened there is rosy and good and virtuous, but overall, the big picture is fantastic. If the standard is human life, if the standard is human prosperity, if the standard is your life and your kids' life, the 19th century is the pivotal century in all of human history that made what we have today possible. And it should be taught and studied like that, rather than demonized in the name of ideology, which I think is what is happening. Crises. Now this is another one of these mythologies. There is no crises under capitalism. Now, yeah, there's sometimes overinvestment happen and a correction happens, sure. But systemic crises, crises that impact the entire economy, Great Depressions, Great Recessions, are not phenomena of capitalism. They're phenomena of statism. The state is what has real systemic risk. Systemic means economy-wide risk. The Federal Reserve, when it makes a mistake, we all suffer. And it always makes a mistake by the very nature of the Federal Reserve. It is never quite right? Because it's a central planner, and central planners screw up all the time. So if you go back to the Great Depression and you study it properly, you realize that it wasn't a market phenomena. It was a phenomena created by the Federal Reserve policies and by Smoot-Hawley, government policy, and by everything else FDR did during the 1930s that sustained the Depression. The Depression is 100%, or as close to 100% as you can get, government-created phenomena. The Great Recession, I don't have time. I've given a 6-hour course. It's online. You can take it on the causes of the Great Recession. Markets did not create the Great Recession. It happened in finance and it happened in housing, two of the most regulated industries in America. Banking is the most regulated industry in America. That's where the crisis happened. It's not surprising. And that's where systemic risk happens, because it affects everything, because the government's involved in it. When the dot-com bubble collapsed, which you could argue is somewhat maybe a market phenomenon, it didn't create systemic risk. One sector went down because it was overpriced. Big deal. But when banking went down, it was everything, because it involved the government, it involved the Federal Reserve. Now, social mobility. Now, this is the funniest one, I have to admit, right? Because what other system has any social mobility? Any. Capitalism is the only system in human history that has made possible poor people to rise up. Before capitalism, you had feudalism, basically. You had aristocrats and peasants, and that's it. And the peasants could never become aristocrats. Suddenly, we freed it up, and we opened the floodgates. And poor people became middle class, and some people became rich. What was Rockefeller initially? Poor. Nothing. He had nothing before he became the richest man in the world. Carnegie, most of those guys. You could become middle class people became rich, and indeed, if you go to Hong Kong, I mean, all these people who came to Hong Kong were dirt poor when they came to Hong Kong. They had nothing when they came to Hong Kong. Now they're middle class and rich, at least a big chunk of them, richer than we are. How did that happen if there's no mobility? If there's no mobility, they'd all still be poor. Hong Kong would be exactly the same as it was 70 years ago. People would have gone there and stayed poor. They came poor and stayed poor. All those immigrants who came to the United States in the 19th century would still be poor. Right? Your ancestors who came here with nothing. Now, maybe some of you, your ancestors came here with something. I can tell you my ancestors, they didn't come here, but wherever they went, came with nothing. They were poor Jews from little shtetls, farming communities in the middle of Poland and Lithuania and Latvia. They knew nothing. They had nothing. And they went, and because of capitalism, they rose and they became middle class, and some of them became very wealthy. Capitalism is the only system in human history with mobility. No other system in human history has allowed poor people to rise up from poverty. Allowed. It's not even allowed. You just leave people alone. And what happens is they produce and they create. So, yes, there's less mobility today in America than there was in the past. And that's sad. And that's horrible. And the reason is that we're not capitalist anymore. We're far from capitalist. The reason is regulations and controls and minimum wages and all the things that government imposes on us to keep poor people poor. Minimum wage being the primary of those, or one of the primaries. Minimum wage keeps poor people poor because it prices young people out of the job market. So they never get a job, which makes sure they always stay poor. Simple economics. So no, social mobility doesn't exist in any other system. Capitalism, when properly functioning, has a huge social mobility. They used to say in the 19th century in New York, from short sleeve to short sleeve in 2 generations or 3? 3 generations, right? First generation was poor, made the money. Short sleeve is poor, represents poverty, right? Second generation lives off of that wealth. By third generation, they've lost it all. They're poor again. So you can go from poverty to wealth and back to poverty, like that. And there are plenty of families to this day who've experienced that. That's real capitalism. Now today, because of regulations and controls and, again, licensing laws and minimum wage laws and all these stuff, we have reduced mobility. That's tragic. But that is because we've moved away from capitalism, not because we moved towards it. All right, next question. Yeah, I promise you.
So earlier when you were speaking, you gave a number of 200 million killed by communism. The highest that number has ever gotten to was through communism, which got up to 100 million. So I don't think there's an actual source for that number. And
okay, I'll give you the 100 million.
And that's the highest. But in the past 10 years alone, there's been 75 million deaths, preventable deaths of people living in capitalist countries. Is that a concern of the state, or are they just not working hard enough to prevent themselves from that?
So that is a 100% made up number. The capitalist state has killed nobody. People are not dying because of capitalism. There is no mass starvation because of capitalism. The only mass starvation is caused by socialism. There is no mass starvation because of capitalism. 75 million is a complete BS number comes out of nowhere. You can laugh all you want, but that is a fact. Socialism killed, murdered more than 100 million people.
That's from the United Nations, sir.
Okay, case. I rest my case.
From hunger, from the United Nations.
Oh, 75 million people died from hunger. Yes, absolutely. In places like Africa that doesn't have capitalism. In places like certain parts of Asia.
White capitalist countries.
What?
Africa was exploited by white capitalist countries for over 100 years.
Oh, that's right. I forgot how rich Africa was before we all came there. There were these skyscrapers there. They were making semiconductors, and we stole it all from them. Give me a break. Africa was poor before. That doesn't justify anything the colonialists did. The colonists, many of them were evil and exploitative and horrible and murderous. But the idea that there was a rich Africa and we, somehow a royal we destroyed it and now they're poor is absurd, nutty, and an evil idea. Let's get it straight. The only system that creates wealth in human history is being capitalism. When Africa adopts capitalism, Africa will be wealthy. It's very simple. And indeed, countries within Africa that have become more capitalistic are becoming richer and becoming wealthier.
Not a single person in this audience came to hear you interrupt and be rude. So you've had a chance to ask your question. We appreciate the question. Thank you very much. And we'll go on to the next question.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. I was talking about my economics professor that capitalism is the absolute worst system except for all the other systems. So I'm a recovering socialist. As we have, but how do you think we're going to reconcile free markets with the rapid consumption of our natural resources? I'm very proud of the wealth that's been created.
So I know there's at least one economics professor in the room right now. The question was that he was told by his economics professor that capitalism is the best system we have. It's not a good system, but it's just the best system we have. Well, that's tragic if that's what's being taught in economics. Capitalism is a great system. It's not just the best system we have. It is fabulous. Because what is capitalism? Capitalism is freedom. Capitalism is leaving people free to live their lives as they see fit. It is a system that says that all the government does is protect your property rights and leave you alone to produce or not as you see fit. And by the way, if you want to be a socialist under capitalism, you can do it. You can get your friends together. You can go set up a commune somewhere, and to each according to his need, from each according to his ability, and live your pathetic, miserable lives in the commune. That's great. I mean, nobody's going to stop you. That's the beauty of capitalism. It's freedom, right? As long as you don't coerce anybody, you can go live your socialist life under capitalism. But to your question about depletion of natural resources, how do we, what do? We're massively consumption, right? And if Africa ever becomes capitalist, they'll start consuming. The Chinese are already consuming. Asia's consuming. We're all consuming. We're getting richer and richer, so we're consuming more and more and more. What happens to natural resources? Well, let me recommend a book to you. It's a fabulous book by an economist by the name of Julian Simon, who died about 10 years ago, called The Ultimate Resource. And in the book, Julian Simon articulates the case, which I support 100%, that there is no such thing as limited resources. That the only limited resource is the human mind. It's the imagination. It's our ability to figure out new solutions to problems. So I've been hearing about peak oil my entire life. We're running out of oil any day now. And somebody uses their mind and figures out fracking, and suddenly there's no limit to the amount of oil in the foreseeable or unforeseeable future. But let's say we run out of oil. What is the resource at the heart? Is it oil? What's the real resource we're looking for? Energy. And then, so are there alternative energies? There's nuclear, maybe solar, maybe wind, maybe there are resources that we can't even imagine today. There are unlimited resources in the world, and that's even before we really get wild. But why not get wild, right? Why limit our imagination? What about mining asteroids? What about going to the moon and seeing what's under there? What about going to Mars? What about shipping resources to Earth, right? Why not imagine and think big, right? There is no limit to human ingenuity, to human resourcefulness, and therefore there is no limit to natural resources. I'm a believer in human reason, in science, in our ability to create and make and innovate. And I think that every time a resource gets expensive enough, entrepreneurs go and find alternatives for it. That's the history of certainly the last 250 years under capitalism, and there's no reason, and there's no, you lack imagination if you can't see that continuing forever. So I don't care how many people live on the planet, the more the better from my perspective, because that means more minds, figuring out more solutions to more problems, and that's fantastic. But we're probably going to maximize it around 10 billion. I don't see any problem in finding the resources for whatever we need with those 10 billion. And I'm not even counting then space exploration and everything else that is possible to human beings. I mean, one of the really sad things about your generation, I think, is that being brought up to not have big imaginations about the future. Because you're like the stagflation, this stagnation generation. Things are just okay. They're just growing slowly. We should think big. We should think boldly about what's possible in the future. Yes. And then I'll go to the back side.
I hate to subvert the point you literally just made, but so if I had to say what one of the ingredients of the secret sauce of capitalism is, it would be that in capitalism you're allowed to fail, and you won't starve to death or get shot. But with certain emerging technologies like genetic modification, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, I worry that if we get it wrong, then it's just game over for humanity. The species goes extinct. So how do you see capitalism's acceptance of failure navigating us through this filter with the species coming out alive on the other end?
So I guess I worry less about that than you do, right? Because I'm more optimistic about human nature, I'm more optimistic about what is possible for individuals to do. I mean, again, the last 100 years, we have a tendency as human beings, and we can speculate on where this comes from, but it's clearly a tendency to be a millennial, to believe that the end of the world is coming any day now. Any day now. It used to be millennial cults. It used to be all kinds of cults, and now it's technology, but it's been technology for a while. We were going to starve to death. Paul Ehrlich told us that hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death in Europe in the 1970s. And then, the seas are going to rise and they're going to flood us all and we're going to die. And that's after, of course, the global cooling of the 1970s. So there's always some story out there where we're all going to die. you know, and I'm skeptical. I think we're pretty resourceful people and we'll figure out ways around it. Now, the story about technology driving out all the jobs and us starving and things like that, again, is something I've heard over and over and over again, and it never comes to fruition. And again, I think it's because people underestimate the resourcefulness and they underestimate the fact that our needs are infinite. What we want as human beings is infinite. Now, I don't know what the future is going to bring in terms of robots and genetic engineering and AI and artificial intelligence. But I think it's exciting. And I think it's fun. And I think you guys should be optimistic about it, not pessimistic, because the pessimism will decay progress. And you should be bold about it. You know, I don't know what human beings are going to be like 200 years from now. You know, you have to be a science fiction writer to find out. Are the chips going to be inside of us? Are we going to have companion robots? I don't know. But it's kind of exciting that we have the possibility of seeing that in the future. You know? So I take it optimistically and positively in terms of what's possible in the future. And yeah, there are going to be risks. But if the risks are as big as you portray them, then there will be, there have to be ways in which to contain those risks, to contain the experiments, if you will. You see Planet of the Apes? Right? Yeah, I mean, that's the doomsday kind of, we play with a virus and it kills us all. Right? Okay. Let's be careful when we play with viruses. And I think when people value their own lives, and when people care about their own lives and their families, and that's their focus, and that's what they're really focused about, and they're not doing it for the state, and they're not doing it for the sake of some collective, then I think people are more careful, more cautious, and more thoughtful about what they do and the science they do. Nuclear weapons were not created by individuals for their pleasure. They were created by the state in order to destroy other states, maybe justifiably, given the war that was going on. But they were created by a state in order to, you know, for the sake of protecting a state. And when people are more focused about themselves, when we live in a place where states are not enemies of one another because each is just focused on protecting its own individuals inside that state, that's when I think you can progress in science without that danger. I think when the state gets involved in that science, that's when it becomes dangerous, and that's what socialism will bring us. So all that technology in the hands of socialists is 1,000 times more dangerous than that technology in the hands of capitalists. Yes?
So I'm not sure that I share your optimism about the future, especially regarding the automation of jobs. So there are a lot of estimates that put the figure around like 40% by the year 2030.
Yeah.
And let's just take that as true. So in that scenario, how do capitalist economic systems account for the fact that not only are 40% of the population unemployed, but they're actually unemployed?
Yeah, well, you don't take that, you don't accept that fact because it's not a fact. It's pure speculation by Luddites who have been making the same speculation for 250 years. If you go back and read journals in 1800, they say the same thing about manufacturing, about jobs in England being replaced by these sewing machine things that are replacing sewers. And the same thing, I remember I've got a Marxist uncle. I've actually got two Marxist uncles. And I remember visiting my Marxist uncle in London in 1986, right? No, in 1987, on the way to the United States. And he was so depressed because he said computers, they're destroying all the jobs. All the jobs are going to be gone within 10 years. 40% of the population is going to be unemployed because computers are replacing everybody. I've heard this story so many times. And to me, when we were young, we never thought these kind of thoughts. And it's tragic to me to see young people thinking, worrying about the future. Don't worry about the future, go live it. But now, this is where I go back to human needs are unlimited. We want, I can't imagine what we'll want in 20 years, 40 years. So let me take some professions that 30 years ago I didn't imagine would exist today. Right? Or 40 years ago, 100 years ago, whatever. Right, you drive in California, I don't know about here in South Carolina, but in California, every strip mall has a nail salon. There are literally thousands of nail salons within driving distance of my house. Right. Now, I don't know what they do in nail salons. My wife goes once in a while, but this is massive business. Let me tell you, 20 years ago, there wasn't a single nail salon within driving distance from my house. But there they are. Right? Restaurants. You guys grew up with the phenomena of celebrity chefs. Chefs, people who cook, are now celebrities. That's bizarre. It's just strange. For our generation, that's strange. Right? What's celebrity chef? How does that work? You may flip a hamburger. That's food. Right? But there's a massive industry today of chefs. And most of us don't eat at home anymore. Because why eat at home when we've got celebrity chefs who cook for us and make great meals? I love it. I love celebrity chefs. I've become a foodie, which is bizarre because I never thought I would be a foodie. But I travel the world to go to celebrity chef restaurants. Like that didn't exist 10 years ago, certainly not 20 years ago. I don't know if we each will have a celebrity chef in our home every single day in 20 years when the robots take over. Because we'll be so wealthy that we'll be able to afford a celebrity chef in our home. And a masseuse. And a personal manicurist and whatever, a pedicurist, right? I don't know. The point is that, again, go back to human ingenuity. What we imagine, what is possible to human beings and what we want and what we desire and what we need is infinite. And we're way too limiting our imaginations to imagine that robots can do everything, that AI will replace all jobs. I'm not worried at all. And I have kids your age. I worry about them, but not because of robots. Right? Because they followed their passion like I told them to. Who figured that they actually listened to me on one thing? And they're both in the arts. And that's a great example, by the way. How many people today do art? I mean, I'm talking about music, comedy, acting, all the stuff that entertains us. Like hundreds of thousands of people are in the arts. You go to LA, everybody's in the arts, right? Somehow they make a living, barely, but they make a living. How many people did arts 100 years ago? Nobody, or almost nobody, few people, right? Because you couldn't make a living at it. But we're so rich today, really, we're so rich. You guys are so rich. You have these supercomputers in your pockets where you can listen to music instantaneously. Pretty much every piece of music ever composed in the entire history of the world is on here. I mean, that's just stunning. It's stunning. And you take it for granted completely, right? So there are millions of people now making music so you can listen to on this thing, who can actually make a living doing that. Not a great living, but a living, right? That didn't exist, again, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. So I don't know what the jobs of the future are going to be. I wish I did. I mean, I'd invest in them and make a fortune, right? I don't know what they're going to be, but I have real belief in the human mind, in human ingenuity, in human reason. Now, there's one caveat to that. That if we don't change our educational system, if we don't start training people to live and to actually do something productive with their lives, then you're right. Then maybe 40% of the people don't have jobs and we've got a real problem. But that's not a problem of capitalism. That's a problem of lousy education produced by guess who? By the state, by the government. Government schools, which Clemson, I guess, is one of. But that, to me, is the problem. Not a problem of capitalism, but again, a problem of systemic risk, where the government controls all the schools, and therefore everybody gets, or almost everybody, particularly if you're poor, gets a really lousy education. That's the real tragedy. Not robots. Bring them on. I can't wait to have my personal robot. I mean, that would be so cool. Yeah, way in the back. Yeah, and then you. No, him, and then you. All right.
You mentioned in your lecture that you came from a socialist state that had healthcare that was, I guess, run by the state.
Yeah.
How would you approach the healthcare market and the system with regards to capitalism and socialism?
Yeah, I mean, I'm consistent, right? Zero state involvement in healthcare. Zero. No Medicare, no Medicaid, no insurance regulation, nada. Let the market work. And what you'll see is beautiful stuff, right? I am a true believer in markets. They work. When you leave people free to innovate, produce, sell, and buy freely, then you get the best products possible. So if you left the insurance industry free of all the regulations and all constraints, they would produce products that would be suitable for you. whether whatever your condition in life was. We would have insurance policies that insured us against pre-existing conditions. That is against one day in the future getting, who knows what we'd have, right? But what we need is 100% privatization of healthcare, a complete privatization of healthcare, not tinkering with Obamacare and changing these exchanges to those exchanges. Get the government out of the way. I often asked audiences, what do you think this is an iPhone, what do you think this would look like if a government committee designed it? Now everybody laughs. I can do this anywhere in the world, any age group, even among socialists. I ask them, what do you think this will look like if a government designed them? They laugh. Because they know it would look horrible and it would function horribly, right? Even socialists know that. Okay, now this is not that important as compared to your health. So let's give government control of our health. They can't do iPhones, but health, education, the two most important things in our entire lives, maybe, right? That we give to government. Right? Like you won't even use the post office if you can use FedEx or UPS, right? But drop your kids off at the post office every morning and let the government tinker with their brain, that's cool. Or go to a government hospital run by the post office, that's okay. It really, if markets are good enough for iPhones, they're good enough for my health care, they're good enough for education, they're good enough for pretty everything. Because this, I'll tell you, this is gorgeous. And it functions brilliantly. And I want health care as good as this. I don't want to limit it goes back to imagination. I don't want my health care limited by some bureaucrat's imagination. And that's what we get today. That's what you have today. And I could go on and on about how rotten socialized medicine is and how destructive it is. Destructive to the doctor and destructive to the patient and destructive to everybody. But I don't need to because you can experience it soon enough. Because that's where we're heading. Yeah, I promised you. Yeah, go ahead.
How does a 100% capitalist economy provide expensive, non-viable, and non-excludable goods like an intact ozone layer or a functioning military?
Well, it provides a functioning military because that is the one function of a government, is to provide for military. So the one thing that the government should do, the one thing the government should raise revenues for, is to provide for military. With regard to an ozone layer, I mean, my view is you let people know that if they continue using product X, they're all going to die. And in a free world, I think people stop using product X because there are lots of alternatives. I don't think it's that tough. I think this idea that we have to force people, that if we, and by the way, I think companies shift, right? Nobody has an interest in destroying, really destroying, not mythologically destroying, but really destroying the world, right? Because they live in the world, and their kids live in the world, and their friends live in the world. And if a company doesn't do it, we boycott them, or we ignore them. So you don't need the state to come in with the guns and the rule of law to protect it. Now, if you can show me that a particular product really damages other people, if there's real harm, then, there's real harm. Then the government has a role to play. If you're spewing cyanide out of your, home, and I'm breathing it and dying, yeah, the government's going to stop you and should stop you. So the role of government is to protect us from rights violations. And to the extent that your activity is doing real damage to me, the government has a role in stopping you. But I generally think a lot of these problems are solved voluntarily. Again, I believe in human beings. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up that about individuals choosing the businesses they want based on modern stuff. And I see examples where that's not been the case. For example, carbon dioxide emissions from these methods. We know that the carbon dioxide fossil fuel companies have spent millions of dollars to try to influence public. Now you can argue over how much that is, but if you have a libertarian society, you need everyone to make decisions that are in their own benefit. How can they do that if companies... I'll give you another example, is that you mentioned the opioid epidemic. You said our life expectancy would be great, but the truth is our life expectancy is going down because of opioids.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen in Europe. We're the country that prescribed 95% of the hydrocodone because we don't have regulations that chronic pain, they had the same signs we did in male. So how do you account for people not being controlled?
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe that the opioid epidemic has much to do with drug companies marketing to doctors. And indeed, I'm glad that doctors in the United States feel free to provide opioids to people with pain. Under socialized medicine, you suck it up. If you're in pain, you suck it up. Now, I've taken opioids because I've had back surgery. That's why I'm wearing this brace. And you take, you get some morphine afterwards. And that's good. I'm really glad that I had that morphine when I was in real bad pain. The challenge is not to get addicted to it and to know what you're doing. And I think it's stunning to me that, yeah, there's structural problems in the system, and we can talk about where those structural problems are. It turns out that they're mainly in Medicare. They're mainly in the socialized part of our system. And with the shift in Medicare, more people getting Medicare with Obamacare, the amount of prescriptions of opioids went up significantly, so there's some correlation there. But more than that, it's stunning to me that nobody actually asks people to be a little responsible for their own lives. Opioids are addictive. What a shock. I mean, I've known that for, 30 years. So when I get out of surgery, I take a few pills and I'm cautious of how I take them, right? And I make sure I don't get addicted to them, right? And I don't take huge quantities. And if I do get addicted, if I did get addicted, then, seek treatment. Take responsibility for your own life. We're so used to, oh no, it's the system did it to me. No, live it, But there are problems. I'm not saying there are no problems. But the problem of the opioids has to do with the fact that the FDA is constraining the ability of drug companies to create drugs that would be alternatives to opioids. Nobody is doing research in alternatives to opioids in terms of pain reduction because it doesn't pay to do such research because it's so damn expensive to get a drug approved by the FDA today.
My comment on the opioid, I'm a physician, and what most people don't know is the opioid epidemic created by the federal government. The CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Commission on the Accreditation of Hospitals, for the past decade and a half have had a campaign on oligoanalgesia, requiring a pain scale as the fifth vital sign of all emergency departments and hospitals. Financial penalties for not addressing pain and prescribing opioids. Right now, the state of West Virginia has a class action lawsuit against the Joint Commission on the Accreditation of Hospitals because they actually sought funding from the makers of OxyContin to support their efforts to push oligoanalgesia. Today, it still stands that when I see a patient in the emergency department with a long bone fracture, if I've not administered a narcotic to them within 45 minutes of their presentation, reimbursement will not come from that patient. The government created a huge pressure on physicians to prescribe, and then when the epidemic hit, all of a sudden it was like overprescribing was the problem, not the fact that they mandated it.
Yeah, and there are all kinds of issues about this. What is the one that's fentanyl or something fentanyl that's coming in from China? And there's all kinds of issues. But it's not drug companies are marketing the drug. That is not the cause. It's much more government policies and the way and personal responsibility and a bunch of other things that are going on in the FDA. And I'll warn drugs. I'll warn drugs as part of this problem so that people are afraid to seek treatment because they're afraid to admit that they're part of this. We've created this whole mentality around what it means to be a drug addict and so on. The array of issues around opioids is massive, with this being the driver, right? And yet, all we can do instinctually is blame drug companies. And I think the same thing with CO2, right? I'm going to put aside the science, because I'm not a scientist. I'm going to put aside the science of global warming. It cannot be the case that the solution for global warming, if it's happening, is to stop using carbon fuels. Because to stop using carbon fuels would mean death and destruction to millions of people, particularly in Africa. So that can't be the solution. It just can't be. So I'm willing to discuss other alternatives, right? And there's even a whole science now going into sprinkling something into the atmosphere to cool the earth down, which scares me. If we're not warming, then who knows what that'll do. But there's all kinds of issues we can discuss in terms of technology. Solar and wind will not substitute for oil and natural gas. It just doesn't work. It's fantasy, given the density of energy. Now, if environmentalists would come to me and say, you know what we want is a campaign for nuclear and hydroelectricity, then at least I'd respect them in saying that they want a real alternative and they want to secure human life. But no, they want to stop carbon fuels, which means to me they don't respect human life. They want people to die. Now, what's the worst that will happen if the Earth is warming? You know, Florida will flood, so they'll move. People will get up and they'll buy a house in Canada, which will now become habitable. Brad can move back to Canada. And they'll buy a house in Canada and they'll move. It won't be the first time human beings have moved because of climate. We move. So Florida will flood. I mean, big deal. Right? I mean, it'll be sad for the people who actually live there, but it won't be a tragedy in historical proportion. What will be a tragedy in historical proportion if we stop using carbon fuels? That would be a real tragedy in millions, hundreds of millions of people will die. So that can be the solution. So it's not drug companies marketing, it's just a fact of reality that without natural gas and oil, we would all die. There's a wonderful book called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels by Alex Epstein. I highly recommend it. The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. Not funded by the oil industry, although he wishes he could get some funding. He does get some funding, but not for that book. The book is a wonderful book, and it explains exactly this. Right? If there is a problem, let's solve it, but let's think about how we solve it without killing off half of the people on the planet. Yeah.
Do you think the government has a legitimate case of things like antitrust laws and monopolies to make barrier to entry?
No. And I don't think there are barriers to entry in a truly free market. So take the worst case, so-called worst case in quotes, of a monopolist in U.S. history before antitrust laws. And that was in the 1870s, Rockefeller Standard Oil. At some point, I think they had 92% of all the oil refining capacity in the U.S. And standard economic theory would suggest that once they reach that, basically it's a monopoly, what would happen to prices? Who's taking Econ 101? They would go up. What would happen to quality? It would go down. Well, it turns out if you actually go in the records and look, the exact opposite happened. Prices went down, quality went up. And you go, what, Rockefeller's an idiot? Why did he do this? And it turns out that Rockefeller understood that there are no barriers to entry in a true free market. That capital is always seeking a return. And if he drove prices up and quality went down, one, competitors would arise. Two, there would be fewer uses for the product he was producing. He was refining oil. And the cheaper he made the refining process, the cheaper he made the product, the more uses there would be. Now guess who competed Rockefeller out of his initial business? What was the initial business that you used oil for? What did we use oil for originally? Light. And do you know who, I don't know if you guys know, but Rockefeller saved the whales. Because before Rockefeller, what was used for light? Whale oil. The whaling industry basically was decimated by kerosene. Right? Now, who competed Rockefeller out of the lighting business? Edison. Now, I want to find the bureaucrat who could have predicted that one. That's called substitution. It's a product that you couldn't, they're not on the same, like this is oil, this is black mucky stuff, and this is electrons moving. And yet one substituted for the other. Substitution, you know. Now, it turned out that by that point, he'd made oil so cheap that he didn't really care losing the kerosene business, because what did he move into? The gasoline business. And there was real competition of what would move cars. And gasoline won out because he had, by that point, made refining so efficient and cheap that, you know, it was the obvious choice for an engine for an automobile, and he made his money that way. And by the way, by the time the antitrust people got around to breaking up Standard Oil, what percentage of the industry did he own by that point? 20-something%. So competition had already driven him down from 90 to 20%, and now they broke him up. So no, if you look at the history, you look at Alcoa Aluminum, you look at IBM, you look at all the big antitrust cases, and what you find is prices were going down, quality was going up, without the government going after these people. It made no sense. And the fact is that people have, I believe people have a right to collude. It's not the rights of consumers, it's property rights. If you want to get together with other business people and collude, you have a right to do it. It's not good economics. Almost always somebody cheats, something breaks up the little scheme that you are doing, but you have every right to do it. You as a consumer do not have a right to get a product at whatever price you want.
I'm sorry.
Oh.
I'm sorry, we are now over time, but Dr. Brook will be happy to stick around for probably another 15 or 20 minutes or so for anyone who would like to ask him questions. Let me just say that the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism is proud to offer a safe space after this lecture. a safe space with soft music, videos of frolicking puppies, coloring books and crayons for anybody who needs it. We always do that when Yaron Brook is here. I'd like to thank all of you for coming out. I think this has been a fabulous time.